It's such a pretty song. Second part of Nigun Waltz from Zusha's album Open Up the Gates. And that one is featuring Eitan Katz. How's everybody doing? Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us on a Sunday night? Nancy in North Carolina, Sharon in New Jersey, Stephen in New Hampshire, Melissa in Great Neck, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Renee in Indiana, Gwen in Michigan, Paul in Chicago, Marianne in Glendale, Tom interrupted his Ukrainian lesson for this. Bella in Florida, Yehuda in South Carolina, Lucy in Minnesota, Dorothy in Pittsburgh. Oy, Sharon, please pray for the soul of my cousin Lisa, who passed away earlier today. Baruch Dayan Emet. So sorry to hear this news. May the neshama have a great aliyah. May her soul have a great elevation in the world of souls, and may her memory always be for a blessing. Say amen. Yosef in Massachusetts, Paula in the great Northwest, and Yitzhak in Kansas City. Welcome, everybody. Okay, we're on page 26 here in Tractate Yevamos, the 14th volume of the Talmud. And with God's help today, we're going to complete chapter 2 and open chapter 3. These are the laws of yibum, the levirate marriage. And we've had this kind of extended Mishnaic digression where first we were looking about what triggers, what sorts of relationships what child what child could the man have had such that he would not be considered childless, and what kind of brother could he have so that he would be considered to have a brother in order to trigger that levirate marriage obligation. Once we asked those questions, we started to look at some prohibited marriages and marriages that even if people were prohibited, but they did it anyway, that the sages would not force them to divorce, or sometimes they would. That's what we've been talking about the last few days. Now we're on 26, right at the top, 26a, with Mishnah number 10 here in chapter 2, the final Mishnah of chapter 2. And all these who were involved in permitting the wife to remarry, as we saw yesterday, if a man came from overseas and testified that a bill of divorce was authentic, that a husband was sending to the wife, so we would accept his testimony that the bill of divorce is authentic, and then the woman would be divorced. But this man who brought the bill of divorce, the agent of the husband who sent it, would be prohibited from marrying the woman who became divorced thanks to that document. And likewise, a sage who heard, who received testimony from a woman about a vow that she made, asking him to nullify her vow because, for example, she vowed never to have relations with her husband, and she needs to break that vow so she can go back to a regular marriage. If he refused to free her from that vow, and as a result she ended up divorced, he could not marry her because he was instrumental in creating her divorce. So for all of these who were involved in permitting the wife to remarry, i.e. the judge, the agent who brought a bill of divorce, and the one who testified for a woman that her husband died, all of them are prohibited to marry the woman who's now free from the previous marriage. But if they had wives at the time of the ruling or the testimony, and their wives died thereafter, then those women they had set free are permitted to marry these men. There is no concern that while their wives were alive, these individuals set their eyes upon another woman. And with regard to all of these women who were prohibited from marrying a certain man due to some suspicion, she was a suspected adulteress, if they subsequently married to other men and then they were divorced or widowed from the second husband, then they are permitted to be married to the man with whom they were suspected of having adulterous relations during her first marriage, i.e. the judge, the messenger, or witness who permitted her to remarry, or not the suspected adulteress, but rather this woman who was, who became free from her first marriage thanks to this judge or agent who brought a bill of divorce, or a witness who testified that her husband had died. So she's not allowed to marry that man. But if she goes off and marries some other man who becomes her second husband, and then that marriage ends, she can come back and marry this guy who was prohibited because he was instrumental in helping her to end her first marriage. And all these women who are prohibited from marrying due to some suspicion, so they are the suspected adulterers, are permitted to the sons or to the brother of those who set them free. That is Mishnah number 10 here in chapter 2. Now the Gemara. So the Gemara taught that if any of the men had wives who subsequently died, these men who as a judge or agent or witness enabled a woman to be free of her first marriage, so if any of these men are married at the time that they did that, then they're not suspected of trying to free this woman from her first husband so that they can go and marry them themselves, because they're already married. Now, it's been a premise of everything that we've been talking about. For instance, co-wives, right? Co-wives are exempted because of a prohibited relationship, which is how we started this whole tractate. It's been a premise that the Torah allows a man to have multiple wives. And here, at the end of chapter 2, we're learning, but if a man was married, we would not suspect that he would, with ulterior motive, help some woman be free of her first husband so that he could step in and marry her. Why not? If he can have multiple wives, what difference does it make if he's married when he's helping this woman become free of her first husband? And the answer is, even though the Torah technically permitted a man to have multiple wives, everywhere where we see in the Torah that there were co-wives, it caused problems, right? Rachel and Leah had problems with each other as co-wives of Jacob. Sarah and Hagar had problems being co-wives of Abraham. And in all these other stories, Solomon had many wives, caused problems that he had multiple wives. So the sages really looked down, even when it was permitted, on the practice of having multiple wives. We never hear of sages themselves having more than one wife. They definitely discouraged the practice, and it was considered something that was very rare. And so this is one of these many cases, like even after the temple was destroyed, we spend a lot of time studying the laws of sacrifices. Likewise, we study all these laws of yibum, but it doesn't mean that they had a lot of practical application in terms of creating co-marriages, as it were, men having multiple wives. And it finally became the law that you could not have more than one wife, actually quite later than the era of the sages, later than the era of the Gemara. It was Rabbi Gershom around 1000 of the year 1000 of the Common Era. So this prohibition is about 1,000 years old. Some say it's halacha, some say it's minhag, that it's custom, but it's a custom that is so strong that it has the force of law, and you're just not going to find a Jewish man with more than one wife. And so since that was already pretty much the practice at the time that the sages were living and issuing rulings, now you see that if a man had a wife, he's not suspected as a judge or as a witness or as an agent to help some woman become free of her first husband so that he could step in and marry her, because he's not gonna marry a second wife. So the Gemara. The Mishnah taught that if any of the men had wives who subsequently died, they may marry those women freed by them. And the Gemara deduces from here, if the wives of those who rendered the woman permitted died, yes, they are permitted to marry the woman that they freed from marriage. But if the wives were divorced, no, it is prohibited. In such a case, marrying the woman that one had rendered permitted would raise suspicion that he in fact planned to marry her all along. So they're definitely avoiding, the sages are avoiding with these rulings, the appearance of impropriety, particularly in these emotional relationship-related matters. Rav Hillel said to Rav Ashi, and yet it is taught in a baraisa, even if they were divorced from their first wives, they are permitted to marry the women that they freed. And the Gemara responds, this is not difficult. This Mishnah is referring to a case where there was a quarrel between the husband and wife at the time that he freed the other woman, as then there is legitimate concern that he was already interested in this woman that he's helping to free from her marriage. And that case of the Baraisa was when there was no quarrel between them at the time. So this man who helped free woman A while he was married to woman B, and then later he and woman B divorced. But at the time that he helped woman A out of her marriage, there was no issue. There was no public spat, as it were, between him and woman B. And so we're not going to say that he's suspected of ending his marriage so that he could go and marry woman A. It wasn't like that, so he's permitted. And if you wish, say, both this and that were said in cases when there was no quarrel between the one who freed the woman and his first wife, and only later did they quarrel and divorce, and this is not difficult. This case of the Mishnah was when he started the quarrel himself, as then there is legitimate concern that he had an interest in this other woman, and therefore sought a reason to divorce his wife. And that case of the Baraisa was when his wife started the quarrel, as then there would be no reason to suspect him of freeing some other woman in order to marry her, since the problems that resulted in his own marriage ending originated with his wife, not with himself. And the Mishnah stated, and with regard to all of these women, if they were married to others and then were divorced or widowed, it is permitted for them to marry those who caused them to be free to marry in the first place. It enters our mind to say that the case referred to here was one of death after death, i.e. the case of a woman whose first husband's death had been substantiated by a single witness, but whose second husband died as well. And also the case of divorce following divorce that had been validated by a single witness. Based on this, should we say that the Mishnah, which permits a woman to remarry, even after her two previous husbands have died, is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi? As, if it is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, didn't Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi say, after 2 times, a woman has a presumptive status to cause death to her husbands, right? So here we're not talking about this issue of a husband who came and testified that her husband had died overseas. He was the witness to that. So now she's free to marry. She goes marry some other guy, and then he ends up dying. So now this man who brought testimony that her first husband had died overseas, is he permitted to marry her or not? Now they're saying Rebbe is raising a totally different issue that doesn't have to do with testimony and who is believed and appearance of impropriety, that this guy who brought the testimony might have been wanting to free her for his own purposes. Rather, it's this issue similar to Tamar, who married 2 sons of Judah, and they both died while married to her. Now this might create some kind of a presumption that basically the woman is unlucky, right? Like it's unlucky to be married to her, or somehow for some reason she causes her husbands to die. Not that she's a murderess, right? They're not saying that she killed the husbands, but for some reason men who are married to this woman end up dead. So maybe, a third guy doesn't want to come along and marry her. Maybe he doesn't know that her first 2 husbands died. Maybe he knows, but he doesn't care. But the court might step in and say, listen, you shouldn't marry her. It's a problem, right? So that's according to Rebbe. That's Rebbe versus the majority. I think the majority say if 3 husbands died, then she has this presumptive status. But at any rate, now that this case has come up where this guy testified that her husband had died, so that freed her to marry. She married a second man. He died. Now the agent who brought the witness who brought that testimony is free to marry her according to this Mishnah, but it would seem that this Mishnah is not in accordance with this other ruling of Rebbe, who says after a woman loses 2 husbands to death, a man should not marry her. Only Rebbe says that. So is our Mishnah in accordance with Rebbe or not? So as if it is in accordance with the opinion of Rebbe, didn't Rebbe say after 2 times a woman has a presumptive status to cause death to her husbands, and such a woman is considered murderous. Therefore, she may not remarry. Since there is no mention of such a concern in the Mishnah, it appears that the Mishnah is not in accordance with the opinion of Rebbe. Now, the Gemara rejects this. No evidence can be derived from here, as the reference here may be to death after divorce or divorce after death. Her 2 marriages ended. Who said it had to happen by death? The Mishnah could be referring either to a woman who was first divorced and then later widowed by her second husband's death, or to a woman whose first husband died and who was subsequently divorced, but not to a case necessarily where she was widowed by the death of 2 husbands. New subject. The Mishnah taught all of these women who were prohibited from marrying the man who freed them due to some suspicion are permitted to the sons or to the brothers of those men who set them free. And the Gemara asks, in what way is this case different from that which we learned in the Tosefta, that one suspected of adultery with a specific woman is prohibited not only from marrying her, but also from marrying her mother and her daughter and her sister. So that's an interesting principle, right? So if this Jewish man is suspected of committing adultery with this Jewish woman who is married to another man, so the fact that there's suspicion about them, that there's rumors flying about them, if she then divorces from her husband, perhaps even because of these suspicions, we prohibit this man who is suspected from marrying her. But not only marrying her, but also her relatives. Now, her relatives are not suspected of committing adultery. So it's an interesting ruling that he can neither marry her nor her close relatives. Yet here we allow his sons so he can't marry her relatives, but it seems that his relatives can marry this woman who is suspected of committing adultery with him. Why? Now the Gemara answers, there is a distinction between the situations. For it is common for women to be at the house of other women and to stay overnight. Therefore, there is a concern that a relative of the alleged adulterer's wife, with whom he was suspected of misconduct, might frequent his house, and he might be tempted to repeat his transgression. On the other hand, it is not common for men to be at the house of other men, so that even if she was married to his relative, the one suspected of misconduct would not generally sleep at the house of the husband. Very odd, sort of observation of behavior as it existed in ancient times. But I guess it seems like men would often be traveling. And while they were traveling, so their wives would go, sleep at a girlfriend's house so that they would feel safer. Maybe that makes sense. But men, I guess when they're traveling, or when the wife is away, they don't go and sleep at a friend's house. I mean, maybe it makes sense just as a matter of basic security. The woman is home alone, it's unsafe, so she's going to sleep at a girlfriend's house. If the man is home alone, he doesn't really worry about safety so much, so he stays alone. This leads to women having sleepovers, but not men having sleepovers. Therefore, this. Very interesting. Alternatively, a different argument could be made. Women are not so strict with one another, as lying with them and having sexual relations with them does not render them mutually forbidden. In other words, if a man commits adultery with his wife's close relative, his wife does not become forbidden to him. So she may not pay attention to his behavior with the woman under suspicion. I mean, this is crazy. This is really patriarchal. So I think what we're learning here is that if a man cheats on his wife and commits adultery and it becomes known, we don't force him and his wife to divorce. In the same way that if a woman cheats on her husband and it becomes known, we force them to divorce. Therefore, the wife is not so concerned that her husband will cheat, because even if he does cheat, it doesn't mean the end of her marriage. Whereas a man is very concerned if his wife cheats on him, because if she does, it spells the end of their marriage. So he's going to pay much closer attention. Okay? So in other words, if the man has relations with a married woman, she is forbidden to her husband, and so men pay close attention to what the others are doing. And the Gemara asks, if so, one's father should be permitted to marry a woman set free by his son as well. So why does the Mishna say their sons or their brothers and not their fathers? And the Gemara answers, certainly his father is allowed as well, but the Mishna is speaking utilizing the style of it is not necessary, meaning it is not necessary to mention the case of his father because he is most certainly permitted to marry a woman set free by his son, as his son is embarrassed before his father and so would not come to sleep with his father's wife. But I might say that since the father is not embarrassed before his son, she may not be married to the son of one for whom there is a suspicion. Therefore, this comes to teach us that there is no such concern. I mean, there's a lot going on there. That actually concludes the chapter. But the bottom line is that we go out of our way, the sages went out of their way to make sure that there was not even an appearance of impropriety. But in situations where the impropriety is really far-fetched, they don't issue the decree because they don't want to issue unnecessary decrees. That concludes chapter 2. Let's go on to chapter 3. Now, chapter 3 and the chapters henceforward here in this tractate are not going to establish new laws of yibum and when yibum applies or when it does not. We basically laid out all the ground rules of when yibum is triggered and when it is not. Now, the sages are, there's going to be digressions, of course, but generally speaking, they're going to look at specific situations and apply the laws that they've established in these first 2 chapters to see how it will play out, when certain incidents happen. So, we're on 26a still, and now we're in chapter 3, Mishnah number 1. In the case of 4 brothers, 2 of whom were married to 2 sisters, and the ones married to the sisters died, then those sisters must perform chalitza and may not enter into levirate marriage. We've actually seen this case already. I don't think I happen to have it on my trusty board here, but we might as well sketch that one out. Give me a second here. Right, so 4 brothers, and we'll go like this. Miriam and Dinah are sisters, and Reuben and Shimon are brothers. Right, so Miriam and Dinah are sisters, Reuben and Shimon are brothers. Then Dinah is married to Reuben, and Miriam is married to Shimon. There's also 2 other brothers, Judah and Benjamin. Right, Benjamin is Benjamin. And they're the surviving brothers. And then these 2 brothers are going to die. So what happens now? Both Miriam and they died childless. So both Miriam and Dinah come before Judah and Benjamin for yibum. They are widows of men who died childless who have surviving brothers. But because there's 2 sisters coming before each of these men, right? So for each of them as an individual, you could say, and let's say we already learned that it's supposed to be the oldest brother who performs yibum. So let's just say that the eldest surviving brother is Judah. So both women come before him for yibum. And so they have some kind of a bond with him because they are coming before him for yibum. So until they perform chalitza, they have this bond with him. Now, you can't have 2 sisters bound to the same man because we know it's prohibited to marry 2 sisters. So now, this is that situation. What does the Mishnah say? In the case of 4 brothers, 2 of whom were married to 2 sisters, and the ones married to the sisters died, then those sisters must perform chalitza and may not enter into yibum. Since both sisters require levirate marriage with each of the surviving brothers, a levirate bond exists between each sister and the brothers. Each of them is considered the sister of a woman with whom each brother has a levirate bond and is therefore forbidden to him by rabbinic law because they are sisters. And if they married the sisters before consulting the court, they should divorce them. For the sages decreed that in this situation they may not remain married. Rabbi Eliezer says that there is a dispute in this matter. Beis Shammai say he may maintain her as a wife, while Beis Hillel say they must divorce. In this situation, they need to perform chalitza. Maybe Judah will perform chalitza with Miriam, and Benjamin will perform chalitza with Dinah. And then the two women are free to go off and marry other guys. The men are free to go off and marry other women. But what they cannot do is perform yibum with these brothers because they are two sisters falling for yibum at the same time. If one of the sisters was forbidden to one of the brothers, so it turned out that Miriam, in addition to being the widow of Judah's brother Shimon, right? Miriam was married to Shimon. Right, so normally, if they had children, they could never marry her because it is the brother's wife, right? This is her sister-in-law. You could never marry your brother's wife unless it's a yibum situation. But it might be that Miriam has an additional relationship with Judah. Perhaps Judah and Benjamin are paternal half-brothers because their father had, a wife and then another wife. And maybe Miriam is related to the second wife, but not the first wife. And so it could be that Miriam is just prohibited to Judah because of this additional relationship. Now that's going to change the matter. So if one of the sisters was forbidden to one of the brothers due to a prohibition against forbidden relations, because she was a relative of his wife or a relative on his mother's side, then he is forbidden to marry her, but he is permitted to marry her sister. Because she is his close relative, she is exempt from levirate marriage with him. Therefore, we don't have the problem of two sisters coming before the same man for yibum. She's exempt from yibum. There is no yibum that even is to be discussed with relative to Miriam. So now really what it is just one woman coming for yibum or chalitza before these two brothers, and now they are permitted to perform yibum with her. They're not forced into chalitza. Because she is his close relative, she's exempt from levirate marriage with him, and therefore she is not bound with him with a levirate bond. Consequently, her sister is not considered the sister of a woman with whom he has a levirate bond, and he is permitted to enter into levirate marriage with her. But the second brother, who is not a close relative of either sister, he is forbidden to marry both of them because both women have a levirate bond with him and their sisters, so both of them are prohibited to Benjamin, right? Miriam has a prohibited relationship with Judah, so Judah could perform yibum with Dinah. But none of them has a prohibited relationship with Benjamin, so Benjamin is prohibited to marry either one of them because they are two women with a levirate bond to him who are sisters, and therefore both are prohibited. If a prohibition resulting from a mitzvah or a prohibition stemming from sanctity, right? Like if one of if the brothers are Kohanim, right? So then they can't, what is it? If one of them is a high priest, right? So if one is a Kohen Gadol, if one of the brothers is a Kohen Gadol, so then he cannot perform yibum with either of the women because they are widows. By definition, they are widows, and a high priest cannot marry a widow. So that's a prohibition resulting from a mitzvah or sanctity. So if a prohibition resulting from a mitzvah or prohibition from sanctity will be transgressed when one of the women marries one of the brothers, then her sister must perform chalitza and may not enter into yibum, as she is considered the sister of a woman with whom he has a levirate bond. In this case, the sister who is forbidden to the brother due to a mitzvah or due to sanctity is bound to the brother for the purpose of chalitza. if one of those women was forbidden to this brother due to a prohibition against forbidden relations, and the second woman was forbidden to that brother due to a prohibition against forbidden relations, then she who was forbidden to this brother is permitted to that brother. In other words, if Miriam had some kind of other close relationship with Judah, such that they have no levirate bond with each other, and Dinah had such a prohibited relationship with Binyamin, right? Like she's related to his mother and Miriam is related to his mother, they're paternal half-brothers, then there is no yibum possible between Miriam and Judah, therefore she's free to perform yibum with Binyamin. Likewise, Dinah has a prohibited relationship with Binyamin, therefore she's free to marry Judah. And this is the case that was referred to when they said, when her sister is also her Yevama, i.e., in a case where two sisters are also Yevamos, and therefore happened for levirate marriage before two brothers. She either performs chalitza or enters into yibum. And this must be referring to a case where each sister is forbidden to one of the brothers due to a prohibition concerning forbidden relatives. In this case, each sister has a levirate bond only with one brother, and she is permitted to that brother, and the prohibition against marrying the sister of a woman with whom he has a levirate bond does not apply because each of them is prohibited to one of the brothers. Therefore, each brother can either perform the act of chalitza or yibum with the sister to whom he is not related. That concludes Mishnah number 1. Now the Gemara. The Gemara deduces from the law cited in the Mishnah. Conclude from here that the levirate bond is substantial, right? Again, the fact before, a brother dies, he has a surviving brother, he had a wife, he died childless. Until they perform chalitza or yibum, they have this levirate bond. And we've discussed this before. The sages argued whether the levirate bond is substantial, because if it is substantial, then the fact that you're bound to this woman and you're going to have to do either chalitza or yibum creates a relationship with this woman. And if she has a sister, that's why everybody must perform chalitza, because you already have a bond. It's like you're married to a woman and her sister. It's not marriage, but it's some kind of a bond, and it is substantial. And now that there's two sisters, boom, it means that you must perform chalitza, yibum not possible. Conclude from here that the levirate bond is substantial. That is, the very obligation of yibum creates a bond that is similar to marriage. For if the levirate bond were not substantial, why would these two women not enter into yibum? After all, these two women come from two different husbands, and they both require yibum. So let this brother perform yibum with one sister, and let that brother perform yibum with the other sister. The fact that our Mishnah requires chalitza in this situation indicates that the levirate bond is substantial and resembles marriage to the extent that each sister becomes forbidden to each brother due to the prohibition against marrying the sister of a woman to whom one has a levirate bond. Right? If you have a bond with a woman, you may not marry her sister. And that is the situation here. Now, the Gemara rejects this reasoning. Actually, I could say to you that according to this Tana who composed our Mishnah, the levirate bond is not substantial, and yet they are still prohibited from entering yibum for a different reason. It is because the Tana, the rabbi of our Mishnah, holds that it is prohibited to negate the mitzvah of yibum. It is prohibited to arrange the matter in such a way that would lead to a situation where the mitzvah to perform yibum is negated. How would this situation arise? Perhaps before one brother consummates yibum, the other brother dies, and only one brother remains. Now, in that case, the second sister would also come before him for yibum. And by performing yibum with one sister, he would thereby negate the mitzvah of yibum with the other sister. When the remaining brother marries one of the sisters, the mitzvah to enter into yibum or perform chalitza is automatically negated from the second sister, as then she is then forbidden to him as his wife's sister. And so since he performed yibum with one of them, you take both chalitza and yibum off the table with the other woman. Whereas if both brothers perform chalitza with one of the sisters, then both women are going to do either yibum or chalitza. And we're going to make them do chalitza, right? But both women will have the chalitza ceremony. Whereas if we arrange things differently so that one of the brothers marries one of the women, then the other woman has no mitzvah, right? It's neither yibum nor chalitza. She's simply free. Now we might think, well, that sounds good, right? She doesn't have to go through this, somewhat emotional and even embarrassing ritual of chalitza. Better she should just be free. But we don't want to, according to this reasoning, we don't want to remove the opportunity to perform a mitzvah, even if that mitzvah is, a difficult mitzvah like chalitza. The Gemara asks, well, if so, if this is the rationale that we don't want to negate the mitzvah behind the ruling of our Mishnah, well, then the same concern would exist if there were 3 brothers as well. Why did the Mishnah specify 4 brothers? It could have cited the case of 3 brothers, 2 of whom were married to 2 sisters. In these circumstances, the concern for negating the mitzvah of yibum also exists. And the Gemara answers, indeed, the ruling would be the same in that case. However, the Mishnah is speaking, utilizing the style of, it is not necessary, meaning, it is not necessary to specify that the women must perform chalitza in a case involving 3 brothers, as certainly the mitzvah of yibum is negated with one of the sisters when the Yevamos marries the other sister. But in the case of 4 brothers, where there is concern only over the possibility that one of the brothers might die, we might have said that we are not concerned over this remote possibility of the death of a brother, and therefore allow the 2 brothers to consummate yibum. The Mishnah therefore teaches us that even in the case where there is concern only for the negation of the mitzvah by way of the death of one of the surviving brothers, still they must perform chalitza and not consummate the yibum. And the Gemara asks, if so, i.e., if we are concerned over the possibility that the remaining brother might die, now we're on 26b, then this should also be true in a case of 5 brothers, 2 of whom were married to 2 sisters and died, and their wives happened before the 3 remaining brothers for yibum. And the Gemara answers, we are not concerned over the possibility of the death of 2 brothers in such a short period of time. New subject. Rav Bar Huna said that Rav said, in a case where 3 sisters who were married to 3 brothers became Yevamos and happened before 2 remaining brothers who were their Yevamim for yibum, then this one brother performs chalitza with one of the women, and the other brother performs chalitza with the other of the women, and the middle, i.e. the 3rd sister, requires chalitza with both of the brothers. Rabbah said to them, from the fact that you say that the middle sister requires chalitza with both of the brothers, it can be deduced that you hold that the levirate bond, that the bond of yibum, is substantial. And it creates a familial relationship. And similarly, this chalitza performed by each of the brothers with the 3rd sister is an invalid chalitza. Since the 3rd woman is the sister of a woman with whom he performed chalitza, it is not possible to consummate the levirate marriage with her. Therefore, the chalitza performed with her is not entirely valid, and it does not release her from the levirate bond between her and the 2 brothers. And there is a principle that invalid chalitza must be repeated by all of the brothers. Each of them must perform an act of chalitza with this woman to ensure that she's free. That's why they're doing it, that both of their brothers have to perform chalitza with the same woman. The Gemara asks, if that is so, the first 2 women should also require chalitza from each of the brothers, because each act of chalitza was invalid, as each woman has the status of the sister of a woman with whom the man has a levirate bond, and it is therefore prohibited for the men to consummate the levirate marriage with them. Why would we? It seems like you're going to make them do chalitza and extra chalitzas because there's an uncertainty of whether the chalitza is valid or not. So to cover all bases, there's extra chalitzas required. Well, why don't you impose that requirement on all the women in this situation? And the Gemara responds, if the case is that they, i.e. the sisters, happen before the brothers simultaneously, it is indeed so that the two brothers would each be obligated to perform chalitza with each of the three sisters. And this law is necessary only in the case where they happen before the brothers, one after the other. How so? One sister happened before the brothers for yibum. And then Reuven, one of the brothers, performed a valid chalitza with her. Another sister happened before the brothers for yibum, and the brother Shimon performed chalitza with her. In this case, Shimon was allowed to consummate the levirate marriage with her if he desired, as she had no family relationship with him at all. When Reuven performed chalitza with the first sister, he removed the levirate bond between her and the other brothers, such that Shimon has no relationship with the first sister at all, and he's free to marry the second sister. Therefore, when he performed chalitza, the act was valid. Another third sister then happened before, I'm almost done, so if you have questions or comments, get them in. Another third sister then happened before the brothers for yibum. When this first brother performs chalitza with her, he terminates the levirate bond, and when this second brother performs chalitza with her, he terminates his levirate bond. However, neither brother can, by performing chalitza, terminate the other brother's levirate bond, because each brother's chalitza is invalid, as each brother is unable to consummate the levirate marriage in this case. And this is due to the woman's status as the sister of a woman with whom he performed chalitza. It's an invalid chalitza, and yet we go through this exercise so that at the end, that middle sister has to do a double chalitza just to cover all bases, and now everybody's free to get on with their lives. That's where we'll end. We're near the bottom of 26b, and let's see if there's any questions or comments. On Yevamos 26. Bill, regarding multiple marriages, I would think that a minhag, a custom, that the sages would have much preferred starts to cross the barrier into halacha. No? Yes. I mean, it does. But it's interesting that they did, it wasn't, it didn't really acquire that status of the law until this Rabbi Gershom, about 1,000 years ago, issued this prohibition on Jews having multiple spouses, right? So it just almost never happened, but it wasn't law. Even if it was a custom that was carried on for centuries, it still didn't become law. I don't know why. It's a good question. But it seems like it was just a minhag until Rabbi Gershom did it 1,000 years ago. Gwen, if it's unlawful for one man to marry sisters, how could Rachel and Leah marry the one man? Because they did so before the Torah was given. We have a tradition that, first of all, hold on a second. By Torah law, it's permitted for a man to have, you're saying, right. Why, by Torah law, it's absolutely prohibited to marry a woman and her sister. So how could Jacob have done that? And the only answer is because that was before the Torah is given. Now we have a tradition that the patriarchs and matriarchs instinctively followed all the commandments of the Torah. But this is one that is, sort of exempt, an exception to that principle. Yes, because the Torah says you can't marry a woman and her sister. Jacob was married to Rachel and Leah, but that happened hundreds of years before the Torah was given at Mount Sinai. Lucy, I wonder if the greater weight of women's adultery is due to the fact that there is no paternity test at that time. Very interesting. Knowing for sure who the father was essential because the lines of patrilineal inheritance determined so much. Property, religious function, whether he's a priest, a Levite, etc. So women's adultery seems to threaten the structure of society, whereas the philandering of the men was more like a personal sin, but didn't create that uncertainty as to the maternity. You always know who the mother is. Very good point, Lucy. Well done. Daniel Vizana says, please show the daf. I don't really have the technical means to do that. So when you're listening, if you want to have the daf in front of you, You can always follow along for free on Sefaria. So it's sefaria.org, sefaria.org, has all the pages of the Koran Talmud, which is what I'm reading here, digitized, thanks to the Steinsaltz Foundation, and many Rav Steinsaltz's son has made the entire digital Steinsaltz Talmud available. It's available on Sefaria. I think it's also available on the OU website, Orthodox Union. It's going to be available, God willing, when we complete it on the Accidental Talmudist app. We're working with the Steinsaltz Foundation on that as well. But right now, it's expensive to get all the books. If it's possible, yes, order the books from Koren or the Art Scroll from Art Scroll. But my setup here, my camera, etc., I can't digitally place the page in front of you. So you'd have to do that on your laptop, on your phone. And there's the Steinsaltz app also. So there's a lot of different ways to get this page in front of you. You always know what the schedule is, so you know what page we're dealing with, but I can't put it in front of you in my video setup. Sharon, wait, what? Why is it not logical for 2 brothers to die when there are 5 brothers, but not illogical when there are 2 or 3 brothers? I think what they're saying is, the question is, it could happen that when there's 4 brothers, right? 2 of them die, and then there's going to be a different outcome with the 2 remaining brothers if one of them dies. But with the 2 remaining brothers, if there's 3 remaining brothers, it's just even less. It's even more remote a possibility that of those 3 remaining brothers, 2 of them are going to die rather than 1. I mean, it's interesting. That it's already pretty remote that having already lost 2 brothers, that now a third of them is going to die. Why is it, consider like that's not remote enough to trigger a no concern ruling? But if there are 3 remaining brothers, that 2 of them should die, that 4 altogether of these 5 would have died. That is remote enough that it does trigger the no concern ruling. I can't explain that. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, the regular Monday time, 6 p.m. Pacific, for page 27. And I'm really starting to feel the need to get caught up. So my plan is to do a double daf tomorrow. If possible, I'll do all the material on both pages. And if not, maybe we'll omit a few passages, and I'll let you know I'm doing that. Just so that we can get back on the Daf Yomi schedule and be caught up with everyone else in the world who's keeping to the schedule. By the way, there's lots of Daf Yomi classes that fall behind, even much more than 1 page. Sometimes 2, 3, 5, a week, 2 weeks behind. It's pretty normal, but it's nice to just stay on the schedule itself. So I'd like to get back on the schedule, and we'll aim to do that tomorrow.